Noah, how are you? How is life? And what is before your speech, I have a question actually. Can you tell
Sure.
us more about the Institute for Corporate Social Innovation? I'm very curious.
Sure. So we are based in the States, but we have a global remit. And we're really looking at all of the ways that companies can have a positive impact on society. So whether that's how do they donate, how do they engage with young people, how sustainable are they? We really look at the big picture. And what we found is that companies that do this are the ones that succeed over time, particularly in times like these. So that's what we focus on, and trust is a big part of that equation.
Cool, lovely. I'm looking forward to hearing your speech, and then we come back for a Q&A, and not only. Thank you. Noah, you have the floor.
Wonderful, thank you. Great. So today we're going to talk about trust, and as we all know, this is a global crisis with many different local challenges and local adaptations. And so this is something that, I look at it primarily from an American and European standpoint, but obviously this is something that has been impacting the world for some time, and something that will continue to have an impact as the world continues to change. And so let me just start by a definition of trust. So what do we mean? Trust is really thinking about the character, the ability, the strength, or most importantly, the truth of someone or something. And obviously, these are very strong words, and words that I think resonate with all of us when we think about trust and also lack of trust. And why is trust important? Well, trust is really fundamental to not just interpersonal relationships, but also the way we connect with organizations and institutions across all sectors, and of course, with society as a whole. But unfortunately, trust is in crisis. So even before COVID, and COVID is, a very interesting case study in and of itself. But trust is really in crisis. So unfortunately, only 1 in 5 people believe the system is working for them. And if you think about, beyond COVID, but really trends that have been happening over the past 5 years, you really see the Me Too movement, racial equity, which is something that we've been really focused on in the States, fake news and misinformation, nationalist movements, really highlighting political polarization. And even in the recent election in the United States, you could really see a very polarized country when the count was so close in so many key states. And so when you look at these separately, it's really interesting to see them as microcosms of a whole undercurrent where these unrelated issues really point to a lack of trust. And so, this is something, oh, sorry. And this is something that's particularly relevant for young people. And, this is obviously a time of radical transformation, and there are so many things happening at once, things that you've discussed at this conference and beyond. But there really is this sense that, trust is decreasing. And one of the reasons for that is because the world is changing, and this is a time of great upheaval and uncertainty, and we're all experiencing this transformation of what's called the fourth industrial revolution, or however you want to call it. But we're really living in a very challenging time where all of the issues are very intense and interconnected. And so what does this mean for society as a whole? Unfortunately, we're really seeing how decreased trust in society as a result of all these issues, both technological and societal, are leading to a lot of feelings of polarization, the fragmentation of society, and just overall disillusion with the system. So again, I think from my kind of American and British perspective, people have really felt like democracy is letting them down in many ways. And this has people lose trust in the system that really impacts the strength and the quality of democracy. And unfortunately, we've seen in the past that this lack of trust has had pretty devastating consequences throughout. So, we've seen nationalism, fascism, and even conflict. And again, this nexus between inequality, social issues, technological changes, it really is this dangerous time, and one that we really have to be aware that in the past, when we've seen this confluence of issues, it really had major impacts on the world. But it's important to note that trust isn't static, right? So trust has been something that's evolving over time, and it really has been evolving with technology. So it's been really interesting to see how trust has really changed as we have changed as societies. And so, it really has evolved from Trust 1.0 to 4.0, and I'll walk you guys through that now. Essentially, Trust 1.0 was interpersonal. So there's something called Dunbar's number, where it talked about communities of 150 people were really the max number of relationships that we could hold in one time. And we really lived in those size communities. So communities were capped at around 150 people. This obviously wasn't a formal rule, but as people reached larger groups, it tended to split off into different tribes and communities. And the reason for that is, we really interacted as a collective, and trust was built accordingly. So we really trusted our own group. But when we looked at outsiders, because we didn't know them directly, there was a lot of skepticism there. And then Trust 2.0 focused on institutions, right? So when you think about the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden we moved to cities, and people started working for large corporations. They really began to rely on more national and local governments to organize their communities, make sure people stayed safe and well. And even the education system, which had up until that point been very informal, all of a sudden that became standardized, and people were really trained to become workers in factories and in large corporations. And so everything changed when it came to how we looked at the world and how we organized ourselves. And that obviously impacted trust accordingly. And then Trust 3.0. So this was really around, I would say Web 2.0, which is kind of the 90s, the early 2000s. But all of a sudden, we started using the internet, and people really focused on individuals. So trust really became about experts. We really looked at, all of a sudden it wasn't about what a big company was saying. It was really about what this expert online was saying. We followed blogs, we followed social media. Instead of relying on companies to launch new products, we actually took an active role in crowdfunded new products. And of course, things like the sharing economy really came to the fore. And so all of a sudden, it was really about, trusting individuals across one another as opposed to these large institutions. But of course, sorry, I don't know why my computer is not cooperating. So sorry. Okay, so basically, Trust 4.0 is what we're aiming for at the moment. And, we've really seen the limitations when we only focus on small communities, which is the interpersonal aspect, or when we only trust institutions to really give us their stamp of approval. or when we just focus on one another, right? So these all have their limitations. And so what we really need to do is build a type of trust focused on interdependence, right? And so how do we focus on all sectors? How do we really help individuals, institutions, and society as a whole think about their ways that they can better society? And that is an interdependent kind of trust. And so that's really what we need to work towards, because these challenges that we're facing, they can't be solved by one sector or by one group of people alone. And so we really need to build that trust and bring everybody on board in order to make those changes accordingly. And so Building Trust 4.0 has a number of different components. We really look at, they're basically continuous. So it's not an either or, it's really a both and situation. And so in order to build that interdependence, we need to engage online and offline, right? We can't just rely on one or the other. And this is proving to be more challenging in times of COVID. But we really need to think about how do we organize ourselves accordingly. We need to focus on old and new power, and I'll get to those definitions in a bit. But it really is that focus on how do we bring old school institutions and these new school communities and networks together to work together and really drive change that way. And then, of course, we can't have global conversations without local conversations, and we can't expect local impact to be enough in today's global world. So we need to really operate on both levels. And so this is a great example of how a company is engaging on and offline. And I mentioned earlier, I'm based in the States, and racial equity is a challenge that we've been experiencing for some time. But these issues have really come to the fore, I would say, over the spring and summer in the United States. And so companies are really taking action accordingly, but it's been interesting to see. This is a slightly older example, but the reason I selected this one is because I think it's great to see how companies have historically been engaging and what they're up to now. So a lot of companies make short-term commitments, but what are they really doing, and how is that really impacting their business and their brand? And so this is an example from Starbucks. And unfortunately, several years ago, there was an arrest of 2 young Black men who were arrested basically for being Black. And so somebody called the police on them just because they were waiting for a friend before ordering. So as you can imagine, this created quite a big deal. Unfortunately, many companies would just say, look, that's a franchise, that's not really headquarters. And so they wouldn't necessarily take this as seriously, especially a few years ago. But Starbucks actually created a series of training modules. So they provided employees with online training on unconscious bias and really other key things that they needed to be successful in their jobs, but also thoughtful human beings. But they also, at the time it was still possible to meet face to face. And so they really brought together working groups, and they shut down all of their stores, and they brought people together locally, but also nationally, to make sure that they really changed their corporate culture from within. And I think they've done pretty well during these recent waves of protests, because they preempted the issue and they took it very seriously. In terms of global and local, so there are really interesting ways that organizations are evolving themselves accordingly. One of those ways that companies are differentiating themselves as leaders in this space is the BeLab movement. And so basically, this is a certification that companies are undergoing to really prove that they are socially and environmentally responsible businesses. And so it's a qualification that they take. It's got very rigorous standards, and great organizations have been participating in this for nearly a decade. But what's been great to see is also large corporations are starting to affiliate themselves with the BeLab movement. and really kind of connect accordingly. So that's been pretty exciting in terms of it went from small and medium-sized businesses to something that large businesses are looking into as well. And what's great about this community is even though there's a global certification, there are local networks. And so, there are regional managers responsible for really figuring out where those socially responsible businesses are and making sure that they're connected locally so that they can actually build local ecosystems and build that trust on the ground. Because we've seen, in the UK, for example, where I lived for quite some time, the previous administration, really talked about citizens and companies of nowhere. So what she meant by that was really that there are a lot of people from all around the world who really focus on the global, but at the expense of the local. And whether or not you agree with that, I think there was a point to be made around how do you engage locally as well. Sorry. And so the final piece of Trust 4.0 is really that sense of old and new power. And this isn't just about business models. This is also about values. And so basically old power was really about people consuming products, right? So it would be, you go to the store and you really wanted a bottle of ketchup. And so the company would advertise to you and really try to make sure that you bought their brand. The next piece was, again, I would say in the early 2000s, businesses really started sharing people's content. So this was really around, social media, blogs, and making sure that people kind of interacted with their content. The next phase of this was around shaping. So how did you remix, right? How did you actually adapt ideas, or content? And then there was the launch of crowdfunding. So people actually supported new business and new ideas with their funds and with their intangible support. So that was really interesting to see as well. So you went from just being somebody that bought products that were already designed externally to actually supporting products that hadn't even been made yet. And then there was this idea of producing, right? So you actually share your own assets with a community, and you are sharing your own product. So whether that's on Etsy, where you're selling crafts, or Airbnb, where you're actually sharing your resources and your apartment. These are all models of how individuals have been producing. And then finally, there's co-ownership. And a great example of this is Wikipedia, where people have this resource which is globally available. And it's something that we created ourselves, right? So these are communities that not just produce content, but also ensure its accuracy. And Wikipedia has been around for decades, and it really is an amazing example of co-ownership. And again, as I mentioned, this isn't just about business models, this is also about values. And I won't get into all of these now, but as you've been hearing throughout the conference, there's, it's really about that maker culture, radical transparency, open source, and not just in terms of, again, the models, but that idea of collaboration, making things available to everybody. This idea of opt-in decision-making and networked governance. And so, I think really rethinking about how do we change power structures, not just through business models, which are really key, but also the values behind them. And so my role in my current position is really to help companies figure out how they can build trust, right? And it's clear that in order to engage the next generation of employees and customers, and also people who are shaping policy around what corporations can do in society, they really need to preemptively build trust accordingly. And so we talk about 3 aspects of how companies can rebuild trust. The first is corporate social innovation, which is the focus of my institute. And that really focuses on all of the ways that companies can make an impact on society. And we define that through philanthropy, right? So how do they donate funds? Corporate social responsibility, which is how do they engage with the community and how do they serve as good corporate citizens? Advocacy, so how do they work with other sectors to drive change? And then shared value, which is how do they create products and services that have a positive impact on society, but also generate a profit. Another thing businesses need to do is to actively reach out to stakeholders. And this goes back to that local engagement, that on and offline engagement, and that new power engagement, right? It really is about how do you reach out to people where they are, and how do you make sure that you're driving change there accordingly? And then the final thing to note is really around authentic engagement. So companies that do this out of lip service, that don't actually make the case for real change and don't put their funding and their resources accordingly, those aren't companies that are going to succeed. Companies really need to engage authentically in order to make their mark. And I think, you know, when you look at these three pillars holistically, that's really how companies are rebuilding trust in society. And those companies that are doing that are actually succeeding financially. Oh, sorry. Why is this?
I'd have some questions. If I think this is probably one of your. I need to ask you a question because you talked about co-owning and bottom-up solutions, let's call them, to regain trust or to build trust.
Yeah.
Which is in itself a process, or should be a process of co-creation. How do you actually build a process of co-creation which goes further than just the process, which goes into implementing solutions? So not just let's have a chat, but also let's do something. We don't have a lot of time left, but I think this is an important question to have.
Sure. So essentially, it really is about that authentic engagement, because young people especially can see through corporate speak, right? So I think it's not just about how to really participate, but it really is also about how do you actually drive change. And again, I think we're seeing that with COVID, with racial equity, with polarization, there's a need to act now. And so companies that are smart are doing that, and they're not just hosting a meeting, but they're actually making real commitments.
Yeah, there's two questions. I mean, I really like it, and we don't have a lot of time, but there's two questions, one from a common friend and one from GF. I don't know if it's a woman or a lady, which says about the BeLab movement. You say companies can become more socially and environmentally friendly, or to some extent friendly. What do you do with those companies that are not joining now and in the future? How can you convince the other companies to get this certificate, I guess?
So there's a really common phrase here in the States called vote with your feet. And the idea is, how can you actually support organizations that are doing the right thing? And that's by working for them, that's by buying their products and services, and that's really by supporting them intangibly, by talking about them and by sharing examples of which ones are doing the right thing. And so those are just a few ways that you can support organizations, because they think, and conversely, how do you really take action on those organizations that you think aren't doing the right thing? And so, whether that's divesting or boycotting their products and services, I think there are so many ways that we can really vote with our feet here.
The title of your speech is Rebuilding Trust in a Broken Global System. A global system is, our global system is very influenced by the United States. I was wondering if you can comment a bit on how trust is seen these days, especially this year in the United States, considering not just the pandemic, but also the, well, we know what. It's quite obvious what happened 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, look, I think it's been a very difficult year in the States particularly, and I would say it's been a very difficult past 4 years in the States. Some people, people look at dramatically different sources of information, and there's a lot of active misinformation out there, but there's also a lot of passive misinformation out there. And so I think just one small takeaway is really about how can we make sure that the sources that we share, and I think many of us, watching this conference are a little bit more discerning, but how do we educate our families and our friends that may not be as discerning, to really focus on, is this a reliable source of information? Because I think misinformation is part of the problem here, and it's unfortunately getting worse.
Yeah. Let's not forget that 1 hour and a half from now, we have at least Joanna Orhozinska from the International Republican Institute that is running the Beacon Project, which is a huge anti-fake news organization at the global level. So, speaking of trust. One last question, and we need to actually go fast towards Pinar Ozkan from the University of Oxford. But I have a question about distrust. Perhaps we need a world in which we trust more, but we also need a world in which we distrust more. So we're more critical thinkers, let's call it. How do you get that positive distrust, let's call it, into the young generation? And if you have one example that pops in your mind on that.
Yeah, so I think there have been a lot of examples of political engagement where people are forcing institutions to become more effective. And I think the racial equity challenges that the states have been facing, young people have really been pushing, particularly companies, to say, okay, well, we really need to change the system here. It's, my students, for example, have actually said to companies, it's great that you're hiring a chief diversity and inclusion officer, but what about the rest of your executives? And so I think we need to be critical, right? We can't take things on face value. And, in the same way that we need companies to engage authentically, we also need to hold them to account to make sure that they are keeping their word. And so, trust isn't about blind trust. It's trust has to be earned. And so I think that's a great place to leave it in terms of, it's up to us to make sure that organizations and institutions earn our trust. And to do that, we really need to share our expectations accordingly.